Welcome to this rapid revision video on society and government in 1558. That's the year that Elizabeth I came to the throne. So we're going to understand how she ruled, but also who helped her to rule. Firstly, let's have a look at Elizabethan social hierarchy. Hierarchy is where society is divided in levels from top to bottom in order of wealth and power. Social status in Elizabethan England generally depended on wealth, and wealth generally depended on land ownership and taking rents from tenants. This is a little bit like the feudal system that you might be familiar with from Norman times, but it's a bit more sophisticated and complicated by the time of Elizabeth. At the top we have got royalty, and of course that would be Elizabeth I herself. And then we have the nobility, a very small section of society. This would be the royal family and major landowners with titles and royal connections, like, for example, earls. Then we've got a slightly larger section. This would be the gentry. These were other major landowners with titles, for example, Sir whatever. Then we have a slightly larger section again. These were the yeomen. These were lesser landowners or lower gentry. They would have owned their own land. They might have received a few rents, but that would have been about it. They wouldn't really have been part of the top flight of society. Underneath that, we've got the tenant farmers. These people rented their land from the yeomen and the gentry, but they may have had some of their independent wealth too. And then we've got the landless or labouring poor at the bottom of society. They worked on the land for the yeomen or on land belonging to the gentry, effectively as farm labourers growing the food. This social hierarchy would particularly apply to the countryside. Then right at the bottom we've got vagrants and the homeless. These are a smaller section of society than the landless and labouring poor, but they lived off begging or charity. They might even be semi-criminal in some areas. However, by the time of Elizabeth, you've got urban areas growing up too. So this would be the social hierarchy in towns, which was slightly different, reflecting the different needs of the towns and cities. There had been some growth in the importance of major towns in Elizabeth's England. Here, where status depended less on farming and land ownership, a different hierarchy existed. Again, a small group at the top. These were the elite merchants. These were wealthy. They often owned property in the city, and they gained wealth from trade. Then a slightly larger section, the professionals. These would have been educated people, for example, the clergy, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and other people who've probably been to university to get their qualifications. Underneath that, we've got the business owners. These would be highly skilled craftsmen who employed others too. And then we've got the skilled craftsmen themselves, people who had learned a trade, for example, coopers who made barrels, carpenters working with wood, and blacksmiths repairing iron tools and making other things from iron. And then at the bottom we've got by far the biggest section of this society, unskilled workers and the unemployed. Those who worked for others but did not need to learn their trade through an apprenticeship, for example. If we take the example of a cooper might have an apprenticeship of several years. In some societies they had to get inside the barrel that was effectively their exit exam and get pushed around in town in it and make sure that it didn't fall apart. Fun as that sounds, if you failed, it meant that you had to go back to your apprenticeship. You didn't really start earning serious money until you'd passed your apprenticeship and became a skilled craftsman. Needless to say, the homeless and vagabonds would also be a part of this society, but we'll deal with the urban poor in a future lesson. Naturally enough, at the top of government was the monarch herself. Queen Elizabeth I held considerable power, represented by the orb, the sceptre and the crown in this, her coronation portrait. She believed that she ruled by the grace of God, an idea that later became known as the divine right. This meant that God had chosen her as queen, and so her authority was beyond question. The queen made all important decisions, acting on the advice of her Privy Council only if she chose to. This included making laws, making legal judgments, declaring war, and making peace, but also calling and dismissing Parliament and granting money, titles, and rewards. Loyalty to the monarch was rewarded with jobs and positions within government. This was known as patronage. This was an effective way of maintaining control, as patronage could, and sometimes was, removed if the monarch was displeased. So good advice really counted. The next stage of government, and very closely related to the monarch, was known as court. Court was the term for all the people who lived near or with the monarch. Court was mostly composed of the most senior nobility, for example, family, and the highest up people in the whole of society. While these might be key servants or friends of the Queen, it was rarely a purely social gathering. Attendance at court required the Queen's permission and could be taken away at a moment's notice. Members of court entertained the Queen and showed off their wealth and power of the nobility. However, they also advised the monarch, and her favourites might have considerable influence over her. So yes, this is why we often get films and TV programmes that are set in royal courts. They're always filled with intrigue. Then we've got the Privy Council. These are the leading courtiers, nobles and advisors and senior officials who made up the Privy Council. The monarch hand-picked the members of the council, and there were usually between 19 and 20 of them. This select group met 3 times a week, or sometimes more, and they were often joined by the Queen herself. They had considerable power. They advised Elizabeth on current affairs, ensured her orders were carried out, and were in charge of security and law and order in England. They also oversaw the actions of the Justices of the Peace, which we'll come on to in a moment, and Parliament. While they would advise the Queen, she didn't actually have to do as they said, but it might be wise for her to do so, as that helped keep them loyal. But equally, they had to show their loyalty in order to keep their position on the Privy Council, so it went both ways. At the head of the Privy Council was the Secretary of State. It's easy to compare this person to the modern Prime Minister, but actually he didn't hold anything like so much power. The Queen's most important advisors of the Privy Council was headed by the Secretary of State. This person was the closest advisor to the Queen and could expect to be consulted on all important matters. However, as we've already touched upon, the final decision always rested with Elizabeth herself. The most important Secretary of State in the period that we're studying is Sir William Cecil, who's pictured here. He was Secretary of State until 1573. He was later raised from the gentry to the nobility when he became Lord Burleigh. So sometimes in sources you'll see him referred to in both ways, either as Sir William Cecil or as Lord Burleigh, but they're the same man. Next up, we've got Parliament. But don't kid yourself that Parliament was anything like as powerful as Parliament is today. While it was important, Parliament had nothing like the power it does in the 21st century. As today, it was made up of the House of Lords, including bishops, and the House of Commons. The House of Commons was elected, but very few men had the right to vote in England. Parliament did not always meet. Elizabeth called Parliament only 10 times in her entire long reign. Some issues like marriage, foreign policy and her successor were considered royal prerogative, and Parliament were forbidden from even discussing them. However, Parliament still had an important role. Only Parliament could issue legally enforceable Acts of Parliament, usually an official endorsement of the monarch's decision, and Parliament rarely said no to these. But also, only Parliament had the power to raise extraordinary taxes too, so these are taxes that go beyond the day-to-day taxes that are always being raised. These were important for the smooth running of royal policy, and a bit of a hangover from days of Magna Carta. You've also got the Lords Lieutenant at a more local level. The monarch could not personally manage law and order in the defence of England in every single county in the kingdom. This job was left to the Lords Lieutenant, one being appointed for each county in England. They also might serve on the Privy Council too if they're important enough. The Lords Lieutenant were in charge of local government and making sure that royal policy was carried out in their county. They also oversaw the maintenance of fortifications and the raising and training of the part-time local armies, the so-called militia, who might be called up in time of war. Also on a local level, we've got the Justices of the Peace. This is often abbreviated simply to JPs. JPs were local landowners who were appointed to keep law and order in their area. Although the job was unpaid, it gave the JP considerable status, and so there was competition to become one. Their role was in local government. They made sure that social and economic policies were enacted, and they acted as judges, hearing court cases for the more serious crimes 4 times a year. Let's sum it up then, our final points. Elizabethan society was organised into a hierarchy with the nobility and gentry at the top. Status was generally based on wealth and land ownership. Landowning yeomen had more status than labourers and those who rented land as tenants. Towns had their own hierarchy, with skill as well as wealth having an impact on status. But the monarch was central to all government. But she could be advised by court, the Privy Council, and particularly by her Secretary of State. National policy was generally set by the Queen with the assistance of Parliament. This especially applied to taxes. And Lords Lieutenant and Justices of the Peace were responsible for local government, law and order and defence. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, please drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, thanks very much, goodbye.